Thank you for having us. I'm Bill Jeffway. I'm the Executive Director of the Dutchess County Historical Society. I'm here with my colleague Melody Moore, the long-serving board member of the Historical Society, and she's head of collections. We are, of course, approaching the Memorial Day holiday, as it's called. And as we approach it, we wanted to take a look at how this very solemn day of remembrance emerged through the lens of Dutchess County and what's behind some of the actions and rituals that we embrace today. I'm going to look at the birth of the idea of the day coming out of the Civil War, and Melody's going to examine how the day got expanded and enlarged after World War I. And we'll get introduced to some of the local veterans along the way, but it's largely a story about how the day came to be. We're calling this, we remember the evolution of Memorial Day in Dutchess County from that period of 1865, from the end of the Civil War to 1920, aftermath of World War I. It's not surprising that the holiday would emerge from the Civil War when you come to understand how deadly that war was, and that it was and remains our deadliest war. Between 1861 and 1865, there's an estimated, at the time they thought about 500,000 who died in service. Current estimates are more like 650,000. That equates to 2% of the population, which would be the equivalent of 6 million people today. So the war was certainly the deadliest war, and as it wound down, we had to think about how to recognize the dead, but also how to reconcile the enormous cost in lives. The day actually begins, the concept of the day, with John Logan, who's head of the veterans group, the Grand Army of the Republic. And here I rely on research of Sean Clay. Sean is the historian of the American Legion and a military historian. And I spoke to Sean about the origins of Memorial Day and his perspective on it. And he said that on May 8th in 1868, there was an order from John Logan. He was head of what would become the leading Civil War veterans organization on the Union side. The Grand Army of the Republic was largely known as the GAR. And I'm quoting Sean here. Logan's order was specifically directed at Union Army veterans and their fallen comrades, and not the Confederate ones. General Order number 11 in 1868, during his first year as Commander-in-Chief, found the GAR was a group for Union veterans. And as such, the order would have applied to the GAR and its associated people and posts. So there were current and parallel traditions, though, on the Confederate side in southern states. General Logan's order had the effect, Sean feels, of nationalizing the effort and creating the holiday as we know it today. So it really is about this order, if you will, from John Logan in May of 1868, declaring this day of mourning and memorial. General Logan actually said the purpose of the day was to, quote, strew flowers and otherwise decorate the graves of comrades who died in defense of their country. We should guard their graves with sacred vigilance. Let pleasant paths invite the coming and going of reverent visitors and fond mourners. Let no neglect, no ravage of time testify to the present or to the coming generations that we have forgotten. So there you have kind of the launch of the idea, which very quickly became popular and embraced. I don't want to get caught up in the logistics of the GAR post, but the GAR was very central to the creation of Memorial Day. So I want to show you a little bit about how it emerged. The very first was in 1867 out of Poughkeepsie, and then you see several posts emerge either as alternates or as combined groups. The veterans of the Civil War, largely from this area, belonged to either the 150th Regiment or the 128th, but they would have been very conscious of their regiment. And some of the reasons behind these splits or differences in posts is that the men are in different regiments. There can be political and personal differences, but in addition to those two regiments, there are at least a dozen other regiments that men might have served in. So in any case, you can see as the GAR grew in strength, and it really was at its peak in the 1880s and 90s, in Poughkeepsie at least, there were some shifting sands. The beacon post comes along in 1870. It's interesting that the first post is named for Captain Lewis McLean Hamilton. I will quickly point out, I was actually surprised to learn that Alexander Hamilton's grandson lived in Poughkeepsie. He's there on the right, the gentleman who died. It was right after the Civil War in General Custer in the what we call American Indian Wars, that this particular Hamilton was killed and remains in the family plot at the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery. And the father of the veteran is Philip Hamilton, the youngest son of Alexander Hamilton. He and his wife were living at the corner of Washington and Maine. So the first GAR post gets named after this Captain Lewis McLean Hamilton, grandson of Alexander Hamilton. And then in the rural posts, if you will, they tended to go around where there were strong military leaders. So in Tivoli, for example, that's home to John Watts de Peyster. He was a brigadier general in the New York State Militia at the time of the Civil War, and the family had many members that served in important military positions. So that was some of what was behind the driving of these other local rural groups. Here's John Ketchum. If you ever wondered about the political influence that Civil War veterans saw, this is a great example because John Ketchum was born in Dover Plains, but served very gallantly in the Civil War, leading the 150th Regiment. He ended up serving 33 years in Congress. And this, I think, is an 1880 campaign sign for President Garfield, Vice President Arthur, and John Ketchum for Congress. So 33-year run in Congress is pretty good. So the question that gets addressed, obviously, in any city or town where there were not GAR organizations, veterans, family, and friends went to cemeteries to decorate graves. So even if there wasn't a GAR organization, there were efforts to recognize those who had given their lives. When people spoke at that time, the message tended to be, of course, about the valor of any individual who's willing to give their life for their country and for their values. They often described what they died for and then tied that principle and value to something that's important today and something worth carrying on, like an unbroken chain. And that, I suppose, was the point of Sean Clay saying that what we see today is intentionally very much founded on what was initially launched and introduced in 1868. I thought we would just take a look at Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, famous for being short. I made it even shorter, just to remind ourselves what Lincoln said the purpose of the war was. And he said it's for the living to be us, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work of the dead that they had so nobly advanced but not finished. And he talks about the fact that they gave their full measure of devotion so that this nation under God can have a new birth of freedom. And so he really was emphasizing the freeing of the 4 million enslaved men, women, and children as the purpose of the war. And you see that reflected again in local exercises. So the earliest Decoration Day exercises, as it would have been called then, started in Poughkeepsie. And if we actually go to 1867, a year before Logan made his declaration, there was a lot of activity and thought and interest in how to memorialize and remember veterans and veterans who, those who had died. But the entire focus was on a monument. There was not much discussion about decoration of graves, although I'm sure that happened to some degree. But the excitement really was around building a monument to the dead. And we will later see that this is the effort that ended up bringing about the memorial fountain in Poughkeepsie that remains there today. 1868, of course, this is the year that the order goes out to have such an event. The order goes out on May 5th. And there were alternative organizations, veteran organizations like the Independent Veterans Volunteers that were very visible, along with the nascent GAR, who planted flags and put flowers at graves. Each cemetery was checked for war dead. And in Poughkeepsie, they found 12 graves, or identified 12 graves in the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery, 3 graves in the Episcopal Cemetery, 1 in the Catholic, none in the Baptist or other cemeteries. And the scenes would have been very emotional because as those individuals went around planting flags and leaving flowers, there were frequently a widow or a parent who was there to receive them and thank them. The speaker that year was William Plato, who was president of the Independent Veterans Volunteers. We've not found a record necessarily of what he said. In 1869, the event became very famous for its torrential rainstorm and the persistence of veterans and the public to decorate graves. Reports describe the arrival at GAR headquarters on Main Street of wreaths, bouquets, crosses, nosegays, pyramids, and baskets of the choicest flowers, their fragrance penetrating every nook and corner of the building. There was a procession to the cemeteries, and again, Captain William Plato spoke. This time, though, he was head of the local GAR, and we don't have a record of what he said, but he did ask everyone to gather around the tomb of Colonel Bailey in the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery, which gives me the opportunity to introduce you a little bit to Colonel Bailey. This is a photograph of his gravestone in the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery. Bailey was someone who did not grow up locally, but seems to have had a lot of local connections and was loved by people here. He graduated from West Point and then went on to serve as colonel of the 1st New York Light Infantry. He was killed in the Battle of Fair Oaks in 1862. And these are photographs of him. As members of the public and veterans came to leave flowers at his grave, his widow was there thanking them. By 1870, we begin to understand a little better what was actually said. There was good weather here, and they estimate, news reports at the time said there were 6,000 people. Major Robert F. Wilkinson was a very well-known lawyer in Poughkeepsie, and he stepped up to lead a unit in the 128th very early in the war. And in his words that he spoke that day, he did not shy away from stating that the cause that so many died for was the removal of the stain of slavery. This is a picture of Wilkinson. He specifically said, "Herein consists the greatness of our victory in the war, that we conquered and overthrew the principle of evil which caused the war and was the inherent weakness of the government, that we established justice and pure laws, and that by lifting up a despised race into the sunlight of liberty, we brought the theory and the practice of the government into accord and fixed the republic on the only enduring foundation of equal human rights. A broken shackle is the proper emblem for every soldier's gravestone. The hate between the two lately warring sections gives place to friendship. Be it our pious duty as the years revolve to keep their memory green, to perpetuate their epitaph. They died to make men free. One of the lessons this day teaches us is that democracy and slavery are utterly hostile and incompatible." So a very clear denunciation of slavery and a celebration of freedom. In 1871, we find another very active decoration day. And in this instance, the lead speaker is a Colonel George Parker. He was very well known locally. He, with his father, operated a mill. He was seen as a very average and great and good guy. He operated a mill with his father for many years. The interesting thing about Colonel Parker is that he served in the 128th, but went on to serve troops in Louisiana that I'll talk about in a minute, known as colored troops. who were freed slaves. So after the Emancipation Proclamation, the Union made every effort to recruit those former slaves into military units, and George Parker was one of the leaders of that. In his speech on Decoration Day of 1871, Parker specifically denounced the resurgence of the KKK, using them by name, in the South, calling it a second rebellion, as no less than the first. Here's some of what Parker said. He said, "We pledge ourselves anew to the principles for which so many sacrifices were made and so many lives were given, and to those men lately in armed rebellion, who were by far too generously pardoned, failing to appreciate the magnanimity of our government. They are defying laws by acts of violence and outright fostering a second rebellion. We say with all firmness, this republic is a natural home of freedom, and its consecrated soil must no longer be stained by the blood of its citizens. The cry of anguish that comes to us from loyal men all through the South has been heard and will surely be answered, we trust, to a purpose that will make the cowardly assassins of Southside Ku Klux grace that gallows which they've invited and richly deserve." So he is almost fanatical about reminding everyone about what that cause was and the freedom that Lincoln spoke to. There were 3 individuals locally who got involved with these so-called colored troops. The troops that they led were, no doubt, would have been eager to fight. These would be former slaves in Louisiana. And Charles Bostwick was from Armenia. He was the senior leader, George Parker from Poughkeepsie, and a man named Van Alstyne, who is important because he came to write a book called The Diary of an Enlisted Man. And if you want to hear about the day-to-day life, first in the 128th, and then as he was involved in the so-called the leadership of these colored troops, I can recommend this book as a very good insight in kind of the day-to-day life of a man like him serving at the time. I will quickly go through where we are with monuments. They were left for us to remember, so we should remember them. I mentioned the emergence in the early days of desire for a monument in Poughkeepsie. There were some ambitious plans to create something from scratch. They ended up buying this fountain, which remains to this day. It's a little out of perspective. The image on the left is from Harper's Weekly, and a 6-foot person would come up to about that shelf of the widest part of the fountain. So it looks like it's about 10 times bigger than it really is. There's a photograph of it with Harvey Eastman's house in the back, Eastman Park. But this was the realization of many dreams. You know, I think over time it started to feel a little worn. I always find this seems, you know, the era of the linen postcard, trying to put this Victorian complexity into some modern perspective. And it doesn't always work. And I just want to point out, when you're memorializing over generations, how you can sometimes have a change in taste. Just first, this is, I think, looking like it's in good shape these days. This is a recent photograph. But it ran into some trouble in the 1930s when the artist Thomas Barrett decided that it was no longer suitable, that it wasn't up to the task of honoring the war dead. And he led an effort to scrap the city fountain. But it looks like he had some formidable opposition from Emmeline and Jonathan, and they look like people that you would not say, you would not want to disagree with. So fortunately for us, Emmeline and Jonathan won, and the fountain remains. But it's a kind of interesting tale of how a memorial intention in one generation can be interpreted by subsequent generations. The other larger and important monuments include a monument at Gettysburg for the 150th Regiment under John Ketchum. There is a monument for the 128th Regiment at what is called Reservoir Square on Cannon Street in Poughkeepsie. Those recent photos. 1898, Beacon erected this monument. This is a recent photograph. And of course, this is a period when Civil War veterans are getting older. And if they're going to leave a mark, they need to leave a mark now. It's also 1899 would be the period of the Spanish-American War. So the Civil War veterans were getting older, other wars were emerging, and you see there was a certain style that was embraced at the time. That one in Rhinebeck. And I just want to begin to wrap up the Civil War by asking, what can we learn from the early days of the movement to memorialize the war dead? John Clay would make the point that what we see today is very intentionally similar in purpose and in practice to what was initiated in 1868. But this is the entire point, that it's a connection of generation to generation with fundamental values and truths so that there is a consistency in approach. World War I ends up being a real pressure point and transition point, but it keeps the concept alive and on track. This is a photograph by Reuben Van Black in our collections of Civil War veterans in a World War I event in Poughkeepsie. And it would have been veterans like this that were born in mind in 1918, when at the Fishkill Rural Cemetery, Congressman Arthur Tompkins spoke at the Decoration Day or Memorial Day services of 1918, Fishkill Rural Cemetery. And I'll read a few of his words. The congressman was specifically addressing the aging Civil War veterans in the audience, and he said, I quote, "In the name of the country you have saved, in the name of the Constitution you defended, and in the name of the government and civilization you placed on a firm foundation, we of the 20th century who are enjoying the fruits of your victory warmly and affectionately thank you. Again, we are engaged in a great war to see whether a nation dedicated to the principles of freedom and equality of opportunity can endure. We are the beneficiaries of the past and trustees of the future, bound to hand down to our children untarnished the rich heritage bequeathed to us by our forefathers." So with that point in mind, in mid-1918, I'm going to hand over to Melody and ask her to talk about how this concept of Decoration Day expanded in World War I.
Thank you, Bill. In World War I, over 100,000 Americans made the ultimate sacrifice, some in battle, some in domestic training camps, some as a result of the global flu pandemic accelerated by the war. Approximately 3,500 men enlisted or were drafted from Dutchess County, and an estimated 125 died in service. Because of the magnitude of the loss, there was a very urgent and very profound matter to deal with. How should we remember, respect, and honor the dead? Summing up the feelings of all Americans, General John Pershing said at the time, "They gave their all, and they have left us their example." Most of those killed in action were buried where they died. The prevailing American sentiment was that the fallen should be brought home. Others, like Pershing or former President Theodore Roosevelt, who lost his son Quentin in France, believed that those lost should be buried where they fell. Ultimately, the War Department surveyed the next of kin of those who died, and the bereaved made their choice among three options: to leave them in the local cemeteries near where they died, to return them home to their families, or to be interred with their comrades in an American military cemetery overseas with the promise of perpetual honor and care for their graves. Coming home was painfully slow. And eventually the remains of 46,000 soldiers were returned, while approximately 30,000 soldiers were laid to rest in cemeteries in Europe. It was not until July 10, 1921, that Pershing stood on the docks in Hoboken, New Jersey, to honor the first transports bringing the heroes home. Of the 125 Dutchess County men who gave up their lives, the remains of 24 Dutchess County soldiers are interred in cemeteries in France. One is buried in Arlington National Cemetery and others locally. The first American pilot killed in action in World War I was not flying an American aircraft, nor even wearing an American uniform. He was, however, from Dutchess County. Sergeant Victor Emmanuel Chapman, who had spent much of his early life in Barrytown, had volunteered to fight for freedom even before the United States got involved in the conflict. When war broke out in 1914, Chapman was a student at the Beaux-Arts Academy in Paris, studying architecture, having graduated earlier from Harvard. He soon joined the French military's fabled Foreign Legion and was quickly trained and sent to the front to serve in an infantry unit as a machine gunner. After a year in the infantry, Chapman transferred to the French Aviation Service, where he was trained as a pilot. He flew with a French unit, first as a bombardier. He was soon flying as a pilot, and when the decision was made to create a squadron, an escadrille in French, it was manned by Americans, and Victor Chapman was one of the first to volunteer. The Escadrille Américaine, as it was first called, was to be a unit made of American volunteer pilots. After a diplomatic complaint, the squadron was renamed the Lafayette Escadrille. Beloved and admired by his comrades, Chapman was known as a brave and sometimes impetuous pilot. He was shot down on what was not even scheduled to be a combat mission, but rather a mission of mercy. Chapman was taking some oranges to a comrade shot down a few days previously and recovering in a field hospital. He was buried where he fell. Edward J. Wolfe was born of a Poughkeepsie working class family in its immigrant second ward. He was the only child of American-born Edward and Eva Wolfe. Edward Jr.'s paternal grandfather, William Wolfe, was born in Darmstadt, Hesse, Germany, on the 4th of July, 1846, and emigrated to Poughkeepsie decades earlier. William had worked making cigars and worked in a saloon. Edward Jr.'s maternal grandparents were born in French Canada and had also emigrated some decades earlier. Excelling in Poughkeepsie High School, Edward Jr. was head of the German club, the Deutsche Verein, his senior year in 1913. He earned a competitive place at West Point shortly after, but his graduation was accelerated so he could serve in France in May 1918. On Friday, September 6, 1918, Edward Jr.'s parents received two letters. One from fellow soldier Henry Meade, who consoled them on the loss of their son. This was the first they had heard the news. The other letter is from Edward Jr., dated August 4th. It was a full 20 days later, Thursday, September 26th, that the parents finally received a telegram from the War Department saying, "We deeply regret to inform you that Lieutenant Edward J. Wolfe died, reportedly in action, August 14. Edward Jr. was killed and is buried 300 miles west of his grandfather William's birthplace." By the 1930s, Edward Sr. and Eva were supporting a $5 prize for a Poughkeepsie High School senior showing excellence in the French language based on Regents examinations. His mother made a government-sponsored trip, a Gold Star Mother pilgrimage, to see her son's grave at the Voisin American Cemetery in France in 1931. A local VFW post carries his name. By coincidence, Wolfe is buried next to a fellow Dutchess County veteran, Austin T. Robinson of Beacon. This is a photograph recently taken by reporter Jim Donick. The stories of those who gave their lives are told in many ways. Family memories, photographs, mementos from foreign lands, and journals and diaries. Perhaps the most personal and the most poignant are letters home. We invite you to hear a portion of J. Morris Goring's last letter home as read by Rich Goring.
We're talking about John Morris Goring. His family called him Morris. He was one of a set of twins. He and his sister Mary were born in Wappingers Falls in 1897 or so. And Morris also had another set of brothers, another pair of twins, Harold and Howard, that were a little bit older. When the war came, Morris was in law school out at Syracuse University. And he and a number of his colleagues from the fraternity there decided they would enlist together. And so all of these guys from Syracuse ended up in a unit that was based pretty much in the Hudson River Valley, the 127th. And they participated in some of the worst fighting of the First World War, principally the assault on the Hindenburg Line. A few years ago, I knew nothing of Morris or his story. We decided to look up in the phone book and see if there were any other Gorings still living in the area. And lo and behold, there was one, Mary Goring. And we never knew her. We had had no contact with her. We didn't know anything more of the family. So on a whim, my mother and I made a phone call to Wappingers Falls, not knowing if we'd get anybody alive or dead or active or not. And here was this sweet old lady, in her 80s by then, and she had always carried the torch for her brother. In one of his letters, Morris referred to her as his better half. And you see that relationship, through what little documentation we have for him. Morris was killed during the war. But Mary wanted us to have his last letter. Knowing that he was going to die, it's so clear from the way he writes. And this was his last letter, or one of his last letters home. And here was this browned piece of paper, 7 or 8, 9 pages in length, where he describes what it's like and tries to prepare his family, his mother, his father, his 2 brothers, his sister, for what he must have thought was the inevitable outcome that was about to come. Sunday, September 22nd, 1918. Dearest Mother, I haven't had time to write since I wrote to Mary, and even now must make this short, as it's nearly 8 and I'm writing by candlelight in Ben McGill's billet. We've had a pretty good time at this place since moving into the billets, though we have worked pretty hard, had lots of rain, and haven't had much time to ourselves. I don't like to put much of this stuff in a letter, as it seems as if anything happened, you might know before receiving this. It looks as though we have a little stunt to do before I'll get a chance to write again. If I should go west, as we say, you shouldn't have any regrets, Mother dear. as there are hundreds of others the same. For the one who dies, it's easy. It is those left that we worry about. It isn't such an awful thing. Just a great experience, a change. We'll see each other again. That we are sure of. Millions, not only Christians, but all human beings. I've led a fairly good life. I've had a wonderful time, great opportunities, and a wonderful mother and family. You must understand, Mother, I don't want to worry you, but if anything did happen to me, I don't want you to feel bad, and you shouldn't. As good as you are, Mother dear, you must know that there is nothing to it, really. Nothing to feel sad about. If I should get picked off, I would die happy. We're sure it isn't the end, so why such an awful thing? No one can conceive of an end of the personality of a loved one. It is infinite. Something that can't die. But you need not know such argument, Mother. You know it is only a change. And in what better way can a man make that change than over here fighting for home, country, civilization, his mother, sister, and sweetheart? But enough. It's more likely that I will come home safe, and that within a year. If I am wounded, don't worry, as not many of them are bad. In fact, a nice little blighty wouldn't be entirely unwelcome. Some of the boys are over there now. We have this little job, so I thought it might be best to say something, Mother, though I don't want to worry you. If anything should happen to me, please drop a line to the bunch at the fraternity house and tell them that I thought of them as often as I could. I sure would like to see Mr. Cunningham, but it isn't very likely. I must close now, Mother, as it is late. Remember, don't any of you worry, as we are well provided for, and don't let my remarks in this letter worry you, please, as it will be all over by the time you receive this. All of you, right often. Good night, Mother dear, and goodbye. Till the next. Your boy is keeping as clean as when he left home, and will be with you soon. Take good care of yourself. With love to all, your boy, Morris. Various countries had different ways of dealing with their thousands upon thousands of dead. The Americans offered the opportunity for parents, relatives to go to the battlefields and actually see where their sons were buried, or they could have them exhumed and sent back home. And Mary and her parents and her brothers decided to have him brought home. So it was 1921, big ceremony and huge floral displays and parades and remembrances of Morris, and welcoming home the other boys too. So Mary kept this letter and a few other, simple little letters, photograph, all her life. She never married. It was the end of their branch of the family. Mary never married. No one could live up to being Morris. No one. And so she cherished these few little mementos and such, and probably would pull out the letter once in a while and read it once more. And then she gets a phone call from a relative. And I hope that she recognized that as a chance to see what we know about Morris brought forth into the oncoming years. Morris is just one of 1.8 million or so that have been killed or wounded in various conflicts. Freedom is never free, and it's a constant battle to maintain our rights, our liberties, our freedoms, both for ourselves and for our friends and allies throughout the world. Freedom is never free, and we want to commemorate the warriors, the people who sacrificed. Nobody wants to go out on a battlefield and die, and yet they do. And they, like Morris, go over the top. They choose their moment. They follow the command. They hear the whistle blow, and they rise up into a maelstrom of machine gun bullets. How do they do that? How?
American memorialization of the war dead took many forms, both at home and abroad. Following the war, General Pershing urged the creation of the American Battle Monuments Commission that would oversee the American cemeteries that would serve as the final resting place for those whose families chose to have them remain in Europe. Dutchess County boys rest today at Saint-Mihiel, Oisane, and Musargon, meticulously maintained shrines to their sacrifice. Back home, memorialization took place in various tangible forms. Local shop owners, like photographer Reuben Van Vleck of Poughkeepsie, created a display in his store window to honor the war dead. Throughout the county, towns and villages erected statues and honor roll plaques to attest to their sacrifices. These are the images of the first temporary wooden memorial listing of the names of Poughkeepsie men who died in service. It was followed by a permanent bronze version that is in City Hall today, and even later an outdoor version in granite. As American Legion posts were created after the war, many were named for the fallen, and Poughkeepsie changed the names of some of its streets to honor the war dead. The war may have been won, but demobilization, like mobilization, took time, and the negotiations that led to the Treaty of Versailles continued until the June 28, 1919 signing. American doughboys began coming home in late 1918, but others remained in Europe some up to a year. When the boys finally got home, welcome home parades were organized throughout the county, and the County Board of Supervisors cast bronze service medals for returning soldiers. Beacon created its own medal for its hometown boys. It was a bright, shining moment. America had made the world safe for democracy and established its place as a leader on the international scene, but had much to remember, while the seeds of the next World War had already been planted. I'll turn it back to Bill to conclude.
We end on this photograph also by Reuben Van Vleck of the then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, marching down Main Street in Poughkeepsie. This is September of 1919, the Welcome Home Parade. And as Melody said, as World War I was ending, World War II was already beginning to arrive on the horizon. And you can't help but think, as you look at this photograph, that this would be the man who'd come to lead and be the commander-in-chief of the armed forces in World War II, and that the children in that parade that day, some of them there holding flags, some of them having more fun, would be of the generation that he would lead into World War II. And the sad tradition and solemn tradition would continue on Memorial Day. So we we see this photograph as an extraordinary transition and turning point to the next generation. And so that unbroken chain of gratitude being maintained and remaining today, we thank you for listening, and we are obviously grateful to those who serve and who are willing to die for our country. Thank you.